Hello, and welcome back to The Language of Power, a podcast brought to you by the European Policy Centre's Europe in the World programme. Every 2 weeks, we bring you insight on the latest geopolitical developments, how they affect Europe, and how Europe can affect them. I'm Paul Taylor, Senior Visiting Fellow at the EPC, and I'll be your host on these deep dives into global and European politics and security. First, let me take this opportunity to wish all our listeners a very happy new year. Well, 2026 is starting very much as 2025 ended. Great powers are taking unilateral action, flouting international law, and cutting transactional deals with each other, or at least trying, while the European Union flounders, counting the points, unable to take a strong stance. They don't even seem to be able to agree on the legality of the US military intervention in Venezuela or of leveraging frozen Russian assets to provide a loan to keep Ukraine in the fight against Putin's aggression. There's no getting away from it. Europe has looked weak, divided, and irresolute in the face of multiple challenges from Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping to its vision of a rules-based multilateral order and to its security and economic interests. Last year, the Europeans accepted a humiliating, unequal trade deal with Trump to avoid more punitive tariffs. They agreed to massive increases in defense spending to try to keep the American security guarantee for Europe and prevent Trump selling out Ukraine. Yet they have little to show for their flattery and appeasement. The Europeans were bystanders when Trump brokered a deal to halt the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza last year. They were bystanders again when the US and Russia sat down to carve up the future of Ukraine without Kiev or Europe at the table. To be fair, European leaders have managed to strengthen President Volodymyr Zelensky's hand somewhat and combined repeatedly to pull Trump back from the brink, from giving away the store to Putin. Yet the new national security strategy, published late last year, demeaned Europe as a stagnant continent facing civilizational erasure due to migration. It spelled out an intention to unravel the EU with the help of populist far-right patriot parties in Europe. Trump is still threatening higher tariffs if the EU enforces its own digital regulations on US tech platforms. And to ram home that point, just before Christmas, Washington barred the author of the EU's digital rules, former Commissioner Thierry Breton, from entering the United States, along with 4 European campaigners against hate speech and online disinformation. What did the EU do about that? Precisely nothing, at least not so far. Well, joining me to discuss how Europe can jump over its shadow and stand up for its interests and values more robustly in 2026, perhaps that should be an if rather than a how, are 2 distinguished analysts and friends who recently sounded the alarm about EU weakness and the risk of Europe becoming irrelevant. Steven Everts is Director of the European Union Institute for Security Studies and a long-time senior aide to EU foreign policy high representatives. Almut Moeller is Director of European and Global Affairs and head of the Europe in the World programme here at the EPC, and thus my boss. Before that, she was Secretary of State for European Affairs of the German state of Hamburg and had a long career in think tanks, including the European Council on Foreign Relations, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and the Center for Applied Policy in Munich. Welcome to both of you. Stephen, let me start with you. You published a striking article in Politico last month on what you called Europe's psychology of weakness. What do you mean by that? Europe, you wrote, is losing confidence, sinking into fatalism, and justifying its passivity with soothing thought that it has no real choice, as its cards are weak. As both an analyst and a practitioner, give us some examples and tell us how you explain that.
Well, thanks a lot, Paul. It's great to be with you again and also with Almut to indeed discuss the many areas in which Europe is falling short. And I think all 3 of us would like a stronger, more self-confident, more robust European Union role in the world. And I think we're going to discuss now, first the diagnosis, what got us into this position of weakness, but also how to get out of this. And I think we should try to strike a balance between these 2 elements. I wrote this article, Psychology of Weakness, out of a sense of frustration. For many, many years as analyst, but also as policymaker, advisor to high reps, I've tried to strengthen EU foreign policy, trying to make sure that Europeans are collectively able to hold their own in a tough world. But you yourself have already indicated many instances last year where we've fallen short when it comes to a very deeply asymmetrical trade deal. Remember, Paul, the European Union was meant to be, have weaknesses in the field of security and defense, but in economic statecraft, no, we have decades of defending our interest and, we can hold our ground. Well, this was a very an illegal deal. It was against WTO rules, but above all, it was an asymmetrical deal, and it was sold to us also on the grounds that we were buying stability, and we were buying also American support for the overriding priority, which is support for Ukraine. And we haven't seen that's the case because the Americans have opened, and you alluded to that, other fronts, particularly in the field of tech. And, we can't really say that since the summer, American support for Ukraine has been rock solid. No, we've seen multiple attempts where, Trump and others around him have trying to sell Ukrainian interest and European security interest. So I think that it was a bad deal, and it spoke to a sense of weakness that we don't have the ability to say no. Gaza was another we talked a lot about over the summer. Since I wrote the article, I regret to say, and you also allude to that in your intro, there have been further instances where Europe has come up short. I mean, indeed, the visa ban on Breton and others is demonstrably against European interest. And then most lately now, of course, when it comes around Venezuela and sort of ripple effects that even reach the shores of Denmark, perhaps we see a sort of an unwillingness for Europeans to articulate, to think and act in terms of power and to hold their own in a very hyper-competitive world. And my last point is, and that's why I wrote it, it doesn't have to be this way, Paul. There are ways. I'm not blind to the limitations and the resource constraints. And I know who we are. We're 27, and it's difficult to get 27 together. But there were instances, not in the very distant past, where Europeans were able to rally together, define common positions and put resources behind it. And we got to recapture some of that spirit. It is feasible.
So how do you recommend overcoming the problem?
Well, I think we need at least two things. We need many things. But one of the things that we need is, nothing succeeds like success in life. And you and me, we've also in the past written together and worked together on instances where Europeans took initiative on strategically relevant issues and developed a policy. Take Iran. Not, years ago, we were hopelessly divided over Iraq in 2003. And then the system pulled back together, saying, no, not again. And there was the whole effort under Javi Solana and successors, and that's maybe an example from a more distant past. More recently, I was there in 2022, in February 2022, and the shock came. Perhaps it should have been less of a shock, because some people were warning about it, but there was a shock when, the whole Russian army was rushing towards Kiev, but the system responded, and we were starting to do things we had never done. The whole story of the European Peace Facility was devised essentially for equipping African armies that we were training with military tools, and we were repurposing that for supporting a country under attack on European soil. We were, breaking all sorts of other taboos, and some of that spirit of 22 we have to recapture. And by God, do we need to? Because what's the biggest change since 22 and today, of course, is the arrival of Donald Trump. Conversations tend to be monopolized by him, and maybe we shouldn't do that. But for sure, we have ample reason to break some of these taboos. And I think that's the last thing I'll say, and I'll look forward to what you and Almut say, is we're not going to get out of this with more integration. Look at the defense field. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. A lot of money is going into the area of European rearmament. And that's right, and it's proper. And it needs to happen for all sorts of reasons. And you yourself and colleagues have written about that, importantly. But I don't think we are quite at the stage where we do that rearmament exercise as a collective European effort. It's still, it seems to me, a sort of piecemeal put together what each of us are going to do more of in the field of European defense. And I think you will have to grapple with the notion of defense integration, and we can perhaps talk about what that means and how you devise structures and financial incentives and other mechanisms to get us there to that level of integration that I think we can't escape.
Well, we're going to come on to that in a second, because I have actually published something last month
I know
about
you
that.
have.
I think we can, at least I have an idea, even though it may not be an easy one. But first of all, let's just go back a couple of weeks, just before Christmas, at the last European Council of 2025. How important was it, in your view, that the EU couldn't agree on leveraging 140 billion euros in frozen Russian central bank assets in Europe to provide a reparations loan for Ukraine, but decided instead to raise a smaller loan for Kiev backed by unused cash in the EU budget? Does that really matter, and why does it make a difference?
Okay. Cards on the table. It is plan B. Also for me. I advocated plan A, which was indeed the use of the frozen assets to make sure that the aggressor pays. It would have been also my preferred option. But plan B, Paul, has benefits. And perhaps I'm often critical, and I was earlier, about decisions or a lack of decisions that are taken. But I think plan B has merits. And one sort of more systemic merit that it has, in addition to making sure that, we finance Ukraine for at least 2 years, probably 2 years, maybe we have to come back to it later, and to make sure that they don't have to swallow a bad deal that Trump and others wish to impose upon it. But the systemic benefit of what came out of December, in my view, is that we normalize the fact that we can do important things at less than 27. And in my read, that this is necessary, given the lineup of political forces we have amongst us. And I think you and me, we know the obstacles and the vetoes and the delays and the weakening, that all that is related. We got to get in a position that we become, relaxed about letting go of the need to always act at 27 and the price you pay for that, and the vision I have for European security and a stronger, more geopolitically aware and capable Europe. It will be built around these kinds of coalitions involving also perhaps the UK, and we'll talk about that perhaps a little bit later. So it's better to do something significant at 24 than be perennially paralyzed by the need to act at 27.
Yeah, I share that view. And in fact, we put out a symposium, the EPC Instant Views, on that, and mine was kind of the only positive one. And colleagues sort of turned to me and saying, "Why are you being so positive about this?" And I said, well, maybe it's because I have a happy childhood. Anyway, Almut, your 2026 EPC Outlook paper, entitled Two Tales in a City, highlights the EU's vulnerabilities and the waning influence, you say, it is exercising in the world, and calls for a new political and security architecture to preserve the idea of European integration as an amplifier of power for Europe's democracies. What might that look like?
Thank you, Paul, and great to be on the podcast. Thanks for the invitation. Great to be here with Steven as well. Perhaps also doing the same that Steven did, and we didn't compare notes before we wrote the pieces. I wrote this piece out of frustration as someone who has worked on strengthening Europe internally and externally for many years. And the way I looked at it was noticing that if you're walking through Brussels, a lot of things seem to make perfect sense. There is the usual routine of activities. Europeans are gearing up. La mise en scène is starting with regard to the next multi-annual budgetary cycle. There are certain routines that are in place and that make the union look as if it was working. And sometimes that's very deceptive. You're listening to the State of the Union speech of Commission President von der Leyen, and you're kind of closing your eyes and thinking, yes, exactly, that's the spirit. You're looking at the annual planning of the Commission that was shared with the institutions, good routine and institutional practice later last year, and it looks meaningful. And you're kind of saying, yes, that's it. And I couldn't then at the same time help the thought and the feeling, which wasn't a comfortable one, that while all of this is happening and, meaningful visits are happening and high-level meetings are happening and meaningful decisions to some extent are being taken, a lot of this was politically hollow. And this made me think about what I think, Paul, at some point you kind of said it's a huge canvas that I chose to look at 2026. And that was a choice because I felt, well, one thing that 2025 should be is a reminder that Europe at this point in time is not about the small things and the sort of the illusion of things working. It's about big stuff. And I chose to compare it somewhat to 1989, but under completely different circumstances. And that's why I came to the point of talking about architecture, which many people criticize me for, saying, the last thing we need now is architecture because, we are having to deal with a world as it is right now, and we need more pragmatism and ad hoc coalitions, etc., etc. What do I mean with architecture? I don't mean that we need another constitutional process at this point in time. We don't need another convention. We don't need treaty reform. I started off my career as a researcher, on institutions and treaty reforms, sort of starting off with the treaty reforms of the late 1990s. I'm not thinking of any of that. What I'm thinking of is a political, and I'm getting to the answer to your question, Paul, a political approach to what Europeans, where they want to sketch a landing patch, sort of collectively as EU Europeans, as non-EU Europeans willing to commit to this, to the fundamental changes that we've seen in the security environment, in the economic environment, both in Europe and in the world. And what does that mean for pooling European resources, for ways of collaborating? And this is something big. This is not something incremental ultimately. And what I'm frustrated with, and have gotten frustrated with more over the past weeks, is that what I'm hearing instead from European leaders is rather deafening silence, even when Europe is kind of, and its very leaders are being ridiculed, are being, sort of made look weak and accept looking weak by all corners of the world, really. And there is deafening silence. There is struggling to find political responses, clear language, and I understand to quite some extent why that is. The vulnerability with regard to security guarantees that don't lie in Europe itself is very clear. The threat, that goes well beyond Ukraine is very clear. But I think we also need to look at what Europeans are increasingly asking for. Citizens that don't understand how the promise of Europe could fall so hollow. And that means Europeans need to go back to thinking big without having to do this now. They need to sketch a political response to 2025. And that starts with European security. And here, Paul, I know you have written a lot, so perhaps we're starting with you putting on the table what your suggestion is. Where I left it was to say, ultimately, it's about the risk of the union completely falling apart. I'm with Steven, who says we need to do things in a pragmatic way differently. Don't talk again about the need for unanimity or, how to overcome this and institutional change. And that we have to do things, and it has to start with regard to Ukraine. It has to start with regard to threats on European sovereignty that are coming from the other side of the pond, which I take very seriously. And it has to start with coming together in new ways, pooling resources. And the European Union, for me, is an integral part of that, if only in its predominantly intergovernmental elements.
I actually saw some of that emerging in 2025 and started writing about it. Essentially, yes, you have an EU that is falling short, that is unable to take decisions at 27, and that has a real reluctance to take decisions at all on some of the big issues for fear of making things worse with the United States. But what I do see is a sort of de facto political and security leadership already being formed, both outside the EU and indeed outside NATO structures, around the EU3, around Germany, France, and the UK. Sometimes Italy, Spain, and Poland are in, sometimes they're not. It was heartening, for example, today, for the first time, we saw European leaders finding a bit of spine and finding their voices to say to Trump quite clearly, hands off Greenland. And to me, that was new and welcome, especially that they did it on the day when they're sitting in also with the United States in Paris, talking about security guarantees for Ukraine. So they didn't wait meekly until they thought they got America locked into that in order to say anything about Greenland. And I think that's a good thing. To me, the question is, can we make this coalition of the willing nations that is emerging around security guarantees for Ukraine into something more concrete, some kind of an institutional form that would enable it to take decisions and to act if necessary? What's your thought on that, Almut?
Well, I mean, I have no intention of declaring NATO sort of fully history. And, for me, this is really very important to sort of find the right balance for European leaders at this point in time. And having said that, I would also not abandon the benefit that the European Union brings beyond its nascent role in security and defense, where we can mobilize a single market, where we can mobilize more the breathing space for the members of the Eurozone to deliver on, their commitments within NATO. But ultimately, for me, the decisive sort of framework needs to be a political one. And here, I think coalitions of the willing and the E3 format, Paul, that you have written about are part of the better news of 2025, because it shows that EU member states are ready to take action. This is also a response to leaders, including in Germany, really feeling the immediate threat and the weight of their oath when they entered office to prevent harm from their people. This is good, but I think it would be foolish to abandon sort of the political clout and also the resources that European Union membership has meant, despite all the differences, when thinking about how to further institutionalize and underpin such coalitions. So that is why we have written at the EPC, Fabian Zulle, Giannis Emanuelidis, and I, revisiting some of the old questions of so-called flexible integration, etc., to say, if countries are moving ahead with coalitions of the willing, it would be wise to find a structure in which we are underpinning their clout with elements of the union that can help sort of strengthen those coalitions. And I know it's not easy at all, in particular with regard to the United Kingdom that has left the union domestically. It's impossible to have any meaningful conversation with regard to re-entry of the European Union, which is why I'm not framing this even as a kind of EU security architecture of some sort. I'm thinking about us in Europe, thinking more smartly again about the power we have at hand in various institutional landscapes, so to speak, bilaterally and smaller fora in the EU context. So for me, this is really the work where I would expect that thinkers, experts, but also politicians would be sort of, battling it out just now and kind of see what is it that we have on the table. This is not happening. There's some cautious maneuvering. There is a fear to further undermine NATO when we know that the reality of NATO is tested every day. For me, this is, again, not the big architectural moment of suggesting, go into another constitutional process of some sort, but a proper idea of institutional realignment. And I think this doesn't take big revolutions, actually. It takes some smart thinking, and we have nascent a nucleus, so to speak, already with what you've been describing, Paul.
Well, it's often the case that we do things in practice before we've agreed how to do them in theory, I think. Steven, the idea that I'm coming up with is, in a way, an attempt to answer the conundrum. If we are going to have a really much stronger European pillar of NATO, how does it find political expression? Within the EU, doesn't represent everybody, as Almut's pointed out. It doesn't represent some of the crucial people that we may need, including Turkey, including Norway, as well as the UK. And within NATO, we have, we have the same awkward squad that we have in the EU, actually, except for the neutrals. So, how does it seem to you?
But the neutrals are not the problem. I don't think the neutrals will be a problem, ultimately. Another thing to discuss,
right.
But sorry for
Steven.
No, look, I agree with you and with Almut very much. We do need to find mechanisms that combine sort of inclusiveness and institutional balance and take into account the different histories that all of us have, but with the necessity to move at the speed of events are imposing upon us. And every hour that we spend on architecture is an hour, in my view, and I listen carefully to what you proposed, Almut. It's the word, you're not really putting it on architecture, but in building political forms of cooperation, as I sort of understand it a little bit. But still, I would like an ambitious coalition that really commits Europeans collectively, but with the Norwegians and with the Canadians and with others that are willing to come our way vis-a-vis Ukraine now. That is really at the order of the day. And Almut, you made another important point, which I fully subscribe to. I think European citizens would welcome that. I genuinely think there's a lot of paralysis and we talk ourselves into, it's so complicated and our publics are not following us. I read the political mood differently, and there's opinion polling that bears this out, that actually maintaining support and increasing support for Ukraine, if framed properly, has majority support across the European political space. A European push to defend our tech rules and defend our democracy and to push out the toxic stuff that others are pumping into our social media spaces would be popular. There are other fields where I'm not sure that maybe perhaps on climate change, or where I genuinely think there is, the moods are shifting and the political balances will have to adjust. But I think there's a lot of support for a more robust, more self-confident Europe that can defend its interests, that can say no if need be, when we have solid grounds to do it. I think this would resonate positively. And I think political leaders, and there aren't many, but there are some. It's a pity that President Macron is so weak domestically, because he's a logical candidate for sort of leadership. My own country may have a prime minister hopefully soon, which I think he gets it totally. And the way that he spoke about Greenland, I thought was, 48 hours ahead of the curve. So there are people out there that I think sort of are ready to tap into that. My friends, I think it does also require, and we tend to shy away from it in these kinds of conversations, also a bit of reprioritization. It will mean that we cannot do all of it. And certainly in terms of money, I mean, the need to defend Europeans from threats that come from all sorts of sides will require a reprioritization also of budgetary aspects, I think, in my view. And that will take us into the discussions on the budget that Almut referenced. And tough trade-offs. But the main point, I would say, to European leaders, dare a little. Your people are, begging for it almost. And not everybody, and people will squabble over the precise, but you can rally a big chunk of European political opinion that is ready to go for this.
Perhaps just, Paul, just to follow, just very briefly, because I think really it's very important what Steven underlines also as a sort of the domestic environment. These are questions of honor and respect. This touches people profoundly, and I've had a lot of conversations with non-EU bubble people over the past couple of weeks who say, how is this possible? How can we be treated like this? This is not right. We should be standing up. So this is something I would really, we've come to this point. Others are kind of almost helping us with this. So let's please jump over, the stick that has been extended to us. It's part of, to decide for something rather than speak against something is actually even easier.
Well, to sum this up, I think we agree this should be a year of greater European self-respect, a year of prioritizing, and a year of just doing it, to steal the Nike slogan, just empowering ourselves to do the things that are most important for us. And support for Ukraine has to be number one in that area. And that's all we have time for this week. But you can find Almut's full Outlook paper and more analysis of European foreign security and defense policy issues on our website, www.epc.eu. The Language of Power podcast will be back in 2 weeks' time with more analysis of Europe's role in the mounting geopolitical turmoil. Thanks to our new program assistant, Simona Lusardi, for helping to put this recording together. And above all, thanks to you for listening in.